What a tough act to follow. I'm a sociologist. How can I, in any way, make this a talk that you enjoy as much as we did the first talk? It's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard. But I'll try my best. I'm an associate professor in sociology from the University of Aalborg, which is northern part of Denmark. For the last 6 years or so, I've been studying diagnosis and its impact it has on social issues, how we can actually see the growth in diagnosis, how many people actually get a diagnosis, psychiatrically speaking, as a kind of society development. That's what I'm going to talk about today, in particular with grief as my starting point. So Alan didn't have any slides, I have slides. I actually went on a course. We have to do that at my university, how to make slides. It's very important, you know. So to get the students and audience like this to follow what you're saying. So I can't have too complicated slides, and hopefully I haven't. We'll see. So the first part of my talk is about prolonged grief disorder, which is going to be the new diagnosis of grief that some of you might know. And I'm going to welcome you to analytical prism that a colleague of mine and I have framed diagnostic culture. So we live in a diagnostic culture. What is that? Next, I'm going to look at prolonged grief disorder in the age of what I refer to as the performance society. That's my way of trying to make a sociological diagnosis of the times in which we live. How can I actually combine these two things? And at the end, I'm going to look at prolonged grief disorder and the risk of overdiagnosis, because we've been widening the boundaries of what grief is in relation to the diagnosis. So what is the point of departure that I'm going to take? Well, first of all, let me start with a kind of observation that I've been doing for the last couple of days. As I mentioned, I'm a sociologist. I do qualitative research. I do ethnographic studies. And I've been doing quite a bit of ethnographic studying while I've been here, actually. And what I've seen is that there's a remarkable agreement about what the problems are that we are facing. So you tend to agree on everything, which for me is a bit disturbing, you know. Because as a sociologist, I'm used to being in conferences where everybody disagrees. I went to a conference once where there was a quarrel over 2 sentences in a book by German philosopher / sociologist Jürgen Habermas. He wrote a fantastic book in '81 called The Theory of Communicative Action. 2 of my colleagues, they quarreled for 2 hours about 2 sentences about this book. We never got to an agreement on anything. But it was fantastic. Here you tend to agree on everything. I don't know whether that's a rightful explanation, but that's the beauty of sociology. It's not a discipline where you can actually kind of say, well, this is the truth, he's right. Everything's debatable. That's also saying that the kind of talk that I'm giving today is definitely debatable. I'm going to present a sociological perspective, not the sociological perspective. So what is my point of departure? Well, it's the diagnosing of grief. We've gone from normal grief to prolonged grief disorder, and we see now the societal embedding of an understanding of pathological grief. The diagnosis is going to be implemented in the ICD-11, but let's pause for a moment here. Because what is grief? If I'm to ask each and every one of you. We'll normally think about grief as the price we pay for love. I mean, it would have been a very not nice life to live. If you haven't loved somebody at a certain point, you will come to grief because you lose this kind of love. So, even though we tend to objectify phenomena such as grief, I think we should start by something very important. Grief is first and foremost a lived experience. It's a human response to the experience of the permanent and irretrievable absence of a loved one. So let me therefore begin this talk by an apt observation by C.S. Lewis. Some of you might know his book, Grief Observed, which is a fantastic book. And in that, he writes the following. We were even promised sufferings. They were part of the program. We were even told, blessed are they that mourn. And I accepted it. I've got nothing that I hadn't bargained for. Of course, it's difficult when these things happen to oneself, not to others, and reality, not in imagination. I think this is perhaps something that we all ought to live by in some way. So why then are we even talking about a diagnosis of grief? Well, those who are in favor of the diagnosis, they say, well, it's the only way we can actually separate what they refer to as normal from pathological grief. It's the only way we can actually separate pathological grief from depression, and it's the only way we can actually get the right kind of treatment for those who actually suffer from pathological grief. So how many are actually suffering from pathological grief? It's always 10%, isn't it? So the estimations are 10%. Those are actually what legitimizes that we are having a diagnosis at all. So we're far away, very far away from, and I have to do this, quote Sigmund Freud. In Mourning and Melancholia, he wrote the following: although mourning involved great departures from the normal attitude to life, it never occurs to us to regard it as a pathological condition and refer to it as a medical treatment. But of course, as Edward Shorter, a very famous historian of psychiatry, once wrote, Freud was just a hiatus in modern psychiatry. He's long gone. What I'm interested in as a sociologist is what has made this transformation possible at all. And I'm going to hint at some possible answers to this question. Well, of course, there's an internal development within psychiatry that we have to take into consideration. Since the DSM-3 emerged in 1980, what sociologist Alan Horwich calls diagnostic psychiatry prevailed. So what he shows is that all the psychodynamically elements within the diagnostic manuals disappeared, and what came instead was a psychiatry who pledged its allegiance to the medical model and referred to diagnosis only in terms of clusters of symptoms. There's always the possibility that we all know better now. Research has made sure that the diagnosis is the right thing to do. That's an argument that I hear a lot. We've become more clever. I don't know. But there's also, and that's what I'm going to talk about now, the emergence of a particular diagnostic culture, which is also supported by what I refer to as the performance society. So what is a diagnostic culture then? Well, a very easy way to define it is saying that it's an overall diagnostic gaze on human problems, suffering, deviances, and discontents that we all meet and face in our everyday life, in our work life, in our educational settings, etc. So what has happened is that an entire language actually has been democratized, traveled from the clinics and medical textbooks into society per se, and into our institutions. So we might even talk about a colonizing language. that has surpassed other languages, be it social, moral, or ethical, in our understanding what it means to suffer, what deviance is, and what discontent is like. Well, the number of diagnoses, of course, have gone up dramatically as well. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of people given a psychiatric diagnosis. But what is more, it seems that there is a general understanding that there ought to be more people giving psychiatric diagnoses. It's just a question about catching them, so to speak. And then, what is for me the most vital part about this development is the fact that there seems to be a systemic institutionalization of this diagnostic gauge in modern welfare states, which has become a very powerful arbiter of treatment options, access to privileges, allocation of resources, etc. So, it has become almost a truism that the diagnosis is the only way to get resources, privileges. If you, for example, have a kid who's a bit uneasy in school, the language has been democratized in such a degree that when I was trying to interview a girl of 13 about her mental situation, she told me that once a school teacher came down to her and said, "You look a bit autistic today, don't you?" What does that mean? Well, of course it means that when we have such languages, when we refer to each other in such a way, we're internalizing this conceptualization. And that has serious consequences. If we look at the current situation through this analytical prism, the emergence of the diagnosis of grief, and therefore also the medicalization and the pathologization of the phenomenon of grief, is at the same time both logical, rational, and even natural. It's logical because it's in sync with the overarching normative ideas within a diagnostic culture. It's rational because it fits very nicely with already established institutionalized practices. It's even natural because the arguments supporting the diagnosis are put forward as commonsensical. They seem to hold the quality of being true without really questioning the normative or ideological context that frames it. But there's another story to it. And that is that the emergence of the diagnosis also mirrors and is supported by what I refer to as the performance society. In this kind of society, rather than docile bodies in a society of discipline that Michel Foucault wrote very fantastically about, the social norms, societal regulations and guidelines are those of individualization, self-realization, that's what we all do all the time, competition, and continuous performance. There's been an idealization of what I refer to as a performance individual who internalizes these features. From my perspective, there's no doubt about the fact that such a society, which I've only been able to hint at here, not only creates and produce, especially young kids today, who feel mentally distressed, it also reduces our understanding what suffering is. Suffering is seen as the antithesis, a hindrance of a fragile, normal performance individual. It's perceived as an individual problem that resides in individuals and that individuals have to deal with. It's my problem. It's seen as a dysfunction that needs to be repaired. To put it rather harshly, and I'm so glad that Iona Heath already paved the way by using one of my favorite sociologists, Sigmund Bauman in her introductory. I love Bauman. Bauman smoked all his life. The story goes that he even declined a professorship in the United States because he was not allowed to smoke in his office. I mean, that never happens anymore, you know? He wrote a book, a great book in 2004 called Human Waste. It's a bit of a title. Suffering can be seen in his perspective as waste of an otherwise ordered, designed, cultivated to progress society that always moves towards the better good and always is in its way to becoming a better society. So what about those who cannot? Those who are set on the outside of this ordered, cultivated society. Well, that's exactly what Bauman frames as human waste. The way I see it, it is actually possible to see the diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder as supported and made intelligible, difficult word, by this societal development. The diagnosis is portraying and emphasizing pathological grief as an individualized disease. The distinction between what is good, that is normal, and bad grief is forcefully categorized and soon to be institutionally implemented. Hence, the diagnostic criteria of prolonged grief disorder represents, and again I put this a bit harshly, the symptomological waste of grief. And of course, waste needs to be taken care of. There's this wonderful passage in the book Bauman where he says, waste is something you need to carry outside the house and put in the bin. Therefore, we need treatment. So what does that leave us in the light of the headline of this conference, namely overdiagnosis? I would say that it's possible to conceive the risk of overdiagnosis in relation to prolonged grief disorders in the following way. The logical, rational, and even natural embedding of the diagnosis within the confines of what I refer to as a diagnostic culture entails that its appearance is very quickly becoming normalized. Which is, of course, something that we ought to debate a lot more than what I see is currently the case. Number two, the understanding of suffering in the performance society calls for treatment. And as I've shown, the only way of treating people these days is by giving them a diagnosis. And now, a PhD student of mine is following the institutional implementation of the diagnosis. GPs, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., are offered official guidelines and recommendations as about to how this diagnosis should be administered. And that's what we're witnessing right now. And this progress is by no means neutral. Not at all. It rather covers a vast array of private as well as public interests in society proliferating the diagnosis as potently as possible. In the research group that I belong to, this is one of the most important issues that we are to deal with in the next 3 or 4 years. Because the phenomenon of grief is not only something that we can refer to anymore as the price we pay for love, It is also something that we have to refer to as a potential pathologized phenomenon that is possibly becoming a more and more growing and affecting more and more people. So this is why I can conclude with rather not provocative in any way, but I think we have to face the fact that when it comes to prolonged grief disorder, the risk of overdiagnosis is not only imminent if we do not do something about it. We'll see in 5 years' time that this is definitely taking place. Thank you very much.